There are some courtroom moments that leave everyone sitting in complete silence, not because a witness raises their voice, not because lawyers begin arguing, but because the details are so difficult to hear that no one seems to know what to do next. That was reportedly the atmosphere as jurors listened to testimony describing what one father says he found when he returned home to what had once been an ordinary family house in Duxbury, Massachusetts. According to courtroom testimony, the home was so quiet that he immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. What happened inside that house has become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent memory, raising painful questions about intent, mental illness, responsibility, and the unimaginable loss of 3 young children. Welcome back, and thank you for spending part of your day with us. If you enjoy thoughtful, carefully researched stories that take the time to explain the facts instead of rushing through the headlines, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing so you won't miss future episodes. Now, let's begin at the start of a case that continues to divide public opinion and challenge even experienced legal experts. Before this tragedy made national headlines, Lindsay Clancy was known by many as a labor and delivery nurse. She lived with her husband, Patrick Clancy, and their 3 young children in the quiet coastal community of Duxbury, just south of Boston. From the outside, their home appeared much like many others in the neighborhood. It sat on a peaceful street lined with trees and well-kept yards, the kind of place where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved as they passed by. Friends and family have described the Clancys as devoted parents who shared photos of birthdays, family outings, and everyday moments. Nothing about those public images suggested that the family would soon become the center of a heartbreaking criminal investigation. Yet according to testimony presented in court, Lindsay Clancy had reportedly been struggling for months before the events that unfolded. Records discussed during the trial indicate that she had sought medical treatment numerous times, speaking with doctors and mental health professionals, while trying different medications under medical supervision. The defense would later point to those medical struggles as a central part of its case, while prosecutors focused on what they describe as deliberate decisions made on the day of the children's deaths. That difference between illness and criminal intent has become one of the most important questions facing the jury. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Whether you're new to the channel or one of our longtime viewers, we're glad you're here. If you enjoy thoughtful, in-depth true crime stories and courtroom coverage, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Now, let's take a closer look at this heartbreaking case. The events at the center of this trial took place on an evening when Patrick Clancy left the house for what appeared to be a routine errand. According to prosecutors, Lindsay asked him to pick up takeout for dinner and then stop at a local pharmacy. Those requests seemed ordinary enough. Families ask each other to run errands every day. Nothing about those errands would have suggested that time was becoming critically important. According to testimony, Patrick first stopped to collect food before heading to a nearby CVS pharmacy. While he was searching for an item in the store, he reportedly called his wife because he could not find what she had requested. He later testified that she sounded quiet but otherwise normal during the conversation. He believed she was simply busy caring for the children, perhaps preparing baths or getting them ready for the evening. Nothing in that brief phone call, according to his testimony, caused him to rush home or suspect that anything unusual was happening. Prosecutors argue that those ordinary errands became something much more significant. They contend that the time Patrick spent away from the house provided the opportunity for the killings to occur. The defense, however, has presented a very different interpretation, arguing that Lindsay Clancy's mental condition at the time is the key issue rather than the sequence of events alone. As the trial has unfolded, jurors have been asked to carefully consider not only what happened, but also why it happened. When Patrick finally returned home, the evening reportedly took a frightening turn almost immediately. He testified that the house felt unusually quiet. Parents often know when something is not right inside their own home. Children playing, talking, or moving from room to room create a familiar kind of background noise. On this evening, according to his testimony, there was none. He called out, "No one answered." He checked the bathroom, believing perhaps the children were taking baths. No one was there. He looked into their bedrooms. Again, no one. At that point, concern began turning into fear. Then he approached the basement door. He called downstairs. Still no answer. According to courtroom testimony, he next attempted to enter the couple's bedroom, but found the door locked. When he managed to open it, he described seeing blood throughout the room. He testified that it looked as though it had been sprayed across the walls. Those words reportedly left the courtroom completely silent as jurors listened to him recount one of the worst moments any parent could imagine. That would have been the end of it for many people. Most would already have feared the worst. But another detail stood out. Patrick still had not found his children. The answers, according to his testimony, were waiting downstairs in the basement, a place where the family often spent time together, where toys were kept, and where the children regularly played. What investigators, emergency responders, and eventually jurors would discover there would become the focus of one of the most emotionally difficult murder trials in recent memory. And it is that discovery, along with the evidence found inside the basement and the questions it raised about intent, mental illness, and responsibility, that brings us to the next chapter of this heartbreaking case. The silence inside the house was only the beginning. According to Patrick Clancy's testimony, after seeing blood in the upstairs bedroom, he rushed back toward the basement. Every passing second mattered. He had called out for his children several times, but there had been no answer. As he made his way downstairs, what he found would become some of the most emotional testimony heard during the trial. He told the jury that he first saw his daughter, Cora. She was lying face down with what he identified as an exercise band around her neck. Without hesitation, he ran to her and removed the band, desperately hoping there might still be some sign of life. According to his testimony, there was none. Only a short distance away was his son, Dawson. Patrick testified that Dawson also had an exercise band around his neck. Once again, he removed it immediately, but the outcome was the same. Still searching, he looked for his youngest child, Callan. He eventually found him in another area of the basement. Patrick later told the court that the moment he saw his youngest son, he knew he was gone. He removed the band from Callan's neck as well before emergency responders arrived. The courtroom reportedly remained completely silent as jurors listened to him describe those heartbreaking moments. Police officers, responding to the emergency, described scenes they said they would never forget. One officer testified that as he came down the basement stairs, Patrick was screaming and pointing toward the children. The officer immediately began checking for signs of life. According to his testimony, he found none. Additional ambulances were requested almost immediately because of the scale of the emergency unfolding inside the home. Emergency responders later testified that the children showed visible injuries consistent with strangulation. Medical experts called by the prosecution explained that exercise bands differ significantly from rope or cord because of their elasticity. According to one medical examiner, keeping enough pressure on such a band requires continuous force, making it more difficult to use than a traditional ligature. Prosecutors argued that this detail was important because it suggested sustained physical effort over a period of time. The defense, however, would later argue that the physical evidence alone could not answer the larger question of Lindsay Clancy's mental state when the children died. At first, that seemed straightforward. 3 children had died. Their father had found them. Medical testimony explained how the injuries occurred. But another detail stood out. The prosecution focused heavily on the timeline leading up to Patrick's return home. According to court testimony, Lindsay Clancy had reportedly suggested that her husband pick up takeout from a local restaurant before stopping at a CVS pharmacy. Jurors later viewed surveillance footage showing Patrick completing those errands. During one of those stops, he telephoned his wife because he could not find an item she wanted. He later testified that she sounded calm enough that he assumed everything at home was normal. Prosecutors argued that those errands were not random. They claimed they created a window of time during which the children were killed. They also pointed to testimony suggesting that Lindsay spoke normally on the phone during that period. According to the state's theory, that conversation demonstrated awareness and control rather than confusion. The defense strongly disputed that interpretation. Defense attorneys reminded jurors that outward appearances do not necessarily reveal what someone experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis may be thinking. They argued that a person suffering from psychosis can still perform ordinary tasks or appear composed while experiencing profound breaks from reality. According to the defense, that distinction is central to the insanity claim presented in this case. As testimony continued, jurors heard more about Lindsay Clancy's medical history. According to witnesses and medical records discussed in court, she had sought psychiatric care repeatedly before the tragedy. Testimony indicated that she had consulted doctors many times, had been prescribed several medications over the course of her treatment, and had even entered an inpatient psychiatric program shortly before the children's deaths. The defense argued that these repeated efforts showed someone desperately trying to obtain help rather than someone living an otherwise normal life before suddenly deciding to harm her family. Medical experts called by the defense explained the difference between postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. They described postpartum depression as a mood disorder affecting many new mothers, while postpartum psychosis was characterized as a far rarer condition involving a break from reality. One psychiatrist testified that a person suffering from psychosis may genuinely believe they are acting to protect their children, even when those beliefs have no basis in reality. She also cautioned that she could not say with certainty what Lindsay Clancy was experiencing at the exact moment of the killings, only that such symptoms are medically recognized in severe cases. Prosecutors challenged that narrative. They argued that planning does not disappear simply because someone later claims to have been mentally ill. During testimony, the state emphasized the sequence of events, including the errands, the phone call, and what they described as opportunities to reconsider. According to prosecutors, each decision leading up to the deaths reflected purposeful conduct rather than an uncontrollable episode. The defense responded that mental illness does not always erase a person's ability to perform actions in sequence. Instead, they argued the real legal question is whether Lindsay Clancy understood the difference between right and wrong at the time of the killings, a key standard under Massachusetts law for an insanity defense. As jurors listened to these sharply different interpretations, they were faced with two competing narratives built from many of the same facts. One side argued deliberate intent. The other argued devastating mental illness. Both agreed on one tragic reality. 3 young children had lost their lives. Then, something unexpected happened. Rather than relying only on photographs and testimony, the judge approved an unusual request that allowed jurors to leave the courthouse and visit the locations connected to the case. That visit would give them a first-hand look at the route Patrick Clancy drove that evening, the house itself, and the basement where investigators say the tragedy unfolded. For many watching the trial, that decision raised an important question. Would seeing the scene with their own eyes change how jurors viewed the evidence? As the trial moved forward, jurors were asked to do something that happens only in a small number of criminal cases. They left the courtroom. Instead of hearing another witness or examining another photograph, they boarded transportation and traveled to the places connected to the case. According to testimony presented during the trial, they retraced the same route Patrick Clancy drove on the evening his children died. The purpose was simple. Jurors needed to see for themselves how long it would have taken to drive from the family home to the restaurant, then to the pharmacy, and finally back again. Prosecutors believed that timing mattered. The defense agreed that it mattered, but argued it did not answer the most important legal question. When the jury arrived at the Clancy home in Duxbury, they viewed the property from outside before entering. Inside, they were shown the rooms where key events unfolded. They also walked down the basement stairs that had been discussed repeatedly during testimony. According to prosecutors, those stairs represented more than just part of the house. Each step, they argued, was another opportunity to stop, another chance to change course. The defense viewed the same staircase very differently. They reminded jurors that the basement was a normal part of family life. Patrick Clancy had an office there. The children often played downstairs. Exercise equipment and toys were kept in the finished basement. Walking the children downstairs, the defense argued, would not have seemed unusual to them. Jurors also viewed photographs showing the basement as investigators found it. Testimony described scattered household items, children's belongings, and emergency medical efforts that followed the discovery. For many observers, seeing the physical layout helped explain witness testimony that had previously existed only as words spoken in court. Then, attention returned once again to Lindsay Clancy herself. Throughout the proceedings, she remained seated in the courtroom, listening, as witness after witness described the events of that evening. According to courtroom observers, there were moments when she became visibly emotional, particularly during testimony about attempts to save the children and descriptions of emergency treatment. Some witnesses reported seeing her wipe away tears. Prosecutors urged jurors not to confuse emotion in the courtroom with legal responsibility. The defense argued that her emotional reactions reflected the devastating consequences of a severe psychiatric illness. The jury alone must decide which interpretation is supported by the evidence. One particularly emotional moment came when Patrick Clancy testified about finding his wife outside the home after searching the house. According to his testimony, she was lying beneath a second-story bedroom window with serious injuries. He said she spoke about herself and what had happened to her before he asked about the children. Only then, according to his testimony, did she tell him they were in the basement. That sequence became another point of disagreement between the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution suggested that her statements demonstrated awareness of what had happened. The defense argued that statements made after an alleged psychotic episode cannot be viewed so simply. Medical experts continued to disagree over what Lindsay Clancy may have understood during those critical moments. One psychiatrist, called by the defense, testified that postpartum psychosis is a rare but potentially devastating mental illness. According to that testimony, a person experiencing psychosis may believe they are acting in the best interests of their children because their perception of reality has become severely distorted. The prosecution did not dispute that postpartum psychosis exists. Instead, prosecutors argued that the evidence in this case pointed toward intentional actions rather than a complete inability to understand right from wrong. Under Massachusetts law, that distinction is essential because an insanity defense requires far more than proof of mental illness alone. Jurors must decide whether the defendant understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions at the time they occurred. As closing arguments approach, Those two competing explanations remain at the heart of the trial. One side asks jurors to focus on planning, timing, and deliberate choices. The other asks them to focus on psychiatric history, medical treatment, and the possibility that severe mental illness destroyed Lindsay Clancy's ability to appreciate reality. Neither side disputes the heartbreaking outcome. 3 young children, Cora, Dawson, and Callan, lost their lives. Their father returned home expecting an ordinary family evening, and instead found himself facing every parent's worst nightmare. Emergency responders, investigators, medical professionals, and jurors have all described the emotional weight of the evidence presented throughout the case. Now the responsibility rests with 12 jurors. They must carefully examine every witness, every exhibit, every medical opinion, and every legal instruction before reaching a verdict. Whatever that decision may be, it will almost certainly be examined for years to come because it touches on difficult questions that have no easy answers. How should the justice system respond when horrific acts intersect with claims of severe mental illness? How should jurors separate sympathy from legal standards? And how should courts balance accountability with medical evidence that remains the subject of intense disagreement? Those are the questions this trial now places before the jury. As always, we will continue following developments and bring you the facts as they emerge. We'd also like to hear your thoughts. Based solely on the evidence presented in court so far, what do you believe will be the most important factor influencing the jury's decision? Share your respectful thoughts in the comments below. If you found this detailed breakdown helpful and would like more carefully researched courtroom stories explained in a clear, conversational way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.